It's 3 a.m. Storm drains are overwhelmed. The rivers are rising. Water is moving towards homes, fast. Phones buzz with alerts. And suddenly, it's not a warning anymore. It's time to evacuate. The question is, are you ready? Everything that makes Maple Ridge incredible, our natural beauty, proximity to wilderness, and rapid growth, also increases our exposure to natural disaster risks and emergency situations. So how can we as a city prepare for the inevitable? The answer begins with you. You're listening to the Real Ridge podcast, where we share the stories behind the headlines on topics that are shaping Maple Ridge. Today, we're sitting down with Edd Bennett, Emergency Response Program Manager with the City of Maple Ridge, to walk through what actually happens in an emergency situation, what city measures are in place to support crisis response, and how your early preparation can make all the difference to keep you and your loved ones safe during an emergency situation. Welcome to the podcast, Edd.
Oh, thank you, Mayor Ruimy. It's a pleasure to participate today, so thanks for having me on.
Before we begin, why don't you just tell our listeners a little bit about you?
Yeah, so I've been involved in emergency response and disaster management for just over 10 years here in Canada. I've undertaken this type of work for the private sector, in the insurance industry, in the critical infrastructure sector, and obviously now here in municipal and local government. Prior to that, I spent a significant portion of time with the UK Armed Forces as well. So quite unique, but I suppose in some ways appropriate blend of experience that helps me to do my job.
Excellent. So you have a lot of experience with this sort of thing.
Unfortunately, yes.
So let's set the stage a little bit. I think we all get accustomed to living comfortably. You got running water, you got flushing toilets, you have a power, electricity, and we generally don't see any issues on a regular basis. It's just that one-time exception that happens, that something pops up. So let's talk a little bit about the risks that Maple Ridge can face.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that actually, if you look at the stats and data that have come to the fore, certainly in the last 5 to 7 years, what that would tell us is nationally across Canada and actually across North America and globally, climate-driven emergency events are on the increase, both in terms of their frequency, but also in terms of their magnitude and the impacts that we've seen. And actually, 2024 was the most expensive year for disaster and emergency events in Canada since records began. And that's figures courtesy of the Insurance Bureau of Canada. So there was almost 8.5 billion in insured losses that were paid out that year. So we are seeing that across the board, these events are taking place. The climate is undoubtedly, unmistakably changing. And while I'm not here to, debate the root causes of that or the why, if we just look at, our own lived observations and experiences here in British Columbia, we're starting to see more droughts, hotter, drier summers. We're starting to see more severe, significant rainfall events that are occurring much later into the year. And we're also starting to experience extremes of temperature, extremes of weather. And of course, underpinning all that being on the sort of Pacific Ring of Fire in a very seismically active part of the world, there is that potential for a significant, impactful earthquake. So from Maple Ridge perspective, we're at that sort of unique intersection of rural and urban environment. We're also in the sort of greater metropolitan Vancouver area, but, different to some of our peers, we have that unique blend of wilderness, agricultural land, both crops and livestock. In addition to that, more sort of straightforwardly, we're surrounded by water on all four sides in Maple Ridge. We have the Alouette Rivers to the north, Fraser River to the south, Pitt River to the west, and the Stave River to the right of us. We also have a number of BC hydro facilities, the Alouette Lake. We have a lot of topography, so we do have that risk for landslides and landslip and avalanche risk as well. A large portion of the beautiful wilderness that makes that wonderful backdrop for the city would also be considered a wildfire urban interface or WUI area. In addition to that, we being a little bit further away from the coast, we do start to see that exposure and risk around sort of extreme heat in particular being something that we're concerned about. So we really do have the sort of full gambit of sort of climate, what we would, sort of term natural hazard risk. But in addition to that, being the gateway to the Port of Vancouver, which is responsible for significant volume of national GDP, we also have, significant rail, marine, and road transportation routes, which also gives us that potential for accidents and spills and other potential issues that we need to work our way through and ensure that we can keep our residents safe from.
It's interesting because when I first moved here in 1990 from Quebec, earthquakes really didn't play an issue for us back east. And when we moved here, that was a big thing. It was all earthquake preparedness and making sure that all our buildings were earthquake proof to whatever extent they could be. And then as we got into the 2000s and the 2010s, there's a shift. The earthquake is still there. The potential for earthquakes are still there, but it's now atmospheric rivers. It's now forest fires that we get every single year. That once in a 100-year storm is happening more frequently. So, there's two ways of looking at this. One is being prepared for it, and the other one is the end result of the cost of that infrastructure, the cost to the public that you mentioned. I think you said $8 billion. That's a lot of money that has to get paid out. So let's start off first with let's back up a second, because you've been in your role now for how long?
With the City of Maple Ridge just coming on 2 years.
2 years. And is this a new position or an existing position?
It did exist previously, but it was essentially a net new position that was created.
Why did you want to come aboard and take on this position?
I think for me, having worked in critical infrastructure previously on response events nationally, often simultaneously, I recall at one point in 2023, my employer at the time was responding to events in 3 provinces and 1 territory. And that was a combination of wildfires, floods, extreme weather, and a mass evacuation from the Northwest Territories. That gave me a front row seat to supporting Indigenous governments and local and provincial governments in terms of their response. So having seen where there was that opportunity to do good and bring my expertise and knowledge to good effect in a local community, and I live in the Lower Mainland, so it was something that I always wanted to take on and see if I could, take a city like Maple Ridge and move it forward. And, with the amazing story that we have here in the last couple of years in Maple Ridge, I was really attracted to, the ethos and the sort of mission of where the city was going, the bold by nature, city on the move, the rapid and impressive growth that we have. And for me, ensuring that we can protect those things and create resiliency.
So I think it's safe to say that you do have an expertise in this field, in this area. So coming into Maple Ridge, you would have done an initial assessment, right? What does this picture look like? Is there a lot of work that has to be done? Where do we stand? What's the scope of the role that you're taking on? So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think regardless of the territory, the area, or the organization that you're looking for, there's a very simple rubric that we look at these things and plan for them. What we're working on is really sort of 3 elements. It's the hazards themselves. Then there's, the exposures that you have to those hazards. People physically being downwind or downstream of events, living in a wildland urban interface, living in a floodplain. And then there's, looking at the sort of third component of that triangle is your vulnerability. So that's looking at where there are existing vulnerabilities, whether they're, vulnerable areas, vulnerable points, single ingress, single egress, vulnerable populations, whether that's, long-term care facilities, schools, correctional facilities, livestock, animals, folks and things that, might need a little bit of extra assistance or present a little bit more complexity in being able to assist before, during and after an emergency. So really it was looking at all those 3 elements and understanding what the picture was. So, and your point a moment ago about, the focus sort of shifting from earthquakes to wildfires and floods, like that is a product of reality. In fact, we have seen over the last 45 years that on North America generally, the days between billion-dollar events has gone from over 120 days down to around sort of 20 days between major events, if we look at North America as a whole. And then, of course, we look internally as well and see what we have, what works well, where are the gaps in terms of our people, our infrastructure, our assets, our capability set. You creating, solutions and services for the public that deliver exceptional value and return on investment for their tax dollars, but also most importantly are safe and work and effective when folks need them. And then I think as we navigate beyond that baseline, a major factor of what we're going to seek to do is around making the mitigation aspect of living alongside these events, giving people the know-how, the knowledge and empowerment to help them make small changes in their daily lives and routines that will help them under these circumstances, but also looking at how they can adapt their homes, their living facilities, their businesses to meet that challenge as we go forward. And that's very important. And whether that's, through initiatives like the Fire Smart initiative, which encourages people to take small, relatively affordable steps to mitigate the risk of ember fall and wildfire, whether it's some of the work that our climate advisor is working on this summer, looking at, how do we potentially flood smart some of our homes, whether it's the Breathe project, which is a small project in partnership with Simon Fraser University and the BC Lung Foundation, where we're showing people how to make fairly low cost air cleaners at home under their own steam. We've got a really exciting new partnership with the University of Waterloo Intact Centre for Climate Adaptation. I think we've got a really solid, firm base, and we need to continue to rehearse, practice and refine that. But I think we also need to really, really heavily focus on preparing, business and our residents to learn fast, to adapt and live alongside these things to mitigate the impact and inconvenience that these major events do cause.
And that's where your role comes in.
Yeah, indeed. I'm sure there's quite a few of your listeners who'll have no doubt come along to one of our Be Emergency Ready sessions. These are fairly detailed, public-facing, in-person workshops where we invite the public to come and learn about, not just our local hazards and what we face, but really give them some tangible, meaningful guidance and steps about how they can, firstly, come to know the risks where they live so they can understand what they're preparing for. That then in turn helps them to formulate a, suitable and successful emergency plan that works for them, their families, their pets, their livestock, and most importantly, their own unique circumstances. We also talk a little bit about how to pull together and gather various supplies that you most likely already have around the house, pull them together so that they can serve you well. And then the importance of, financial readiness and preparedness, be that in the form of accessing adequate insurance coverage, educating people around what financial supports are available from all levels of government. And that's usually quite a profound moment for a lot of the folks in the workshop. And then we also talk about actually the most important part of all, which is recognizing when and how to put your plan into action and execute it successfully and safely. That's been the sort of cornerstone of our public outreach. We do a significant amount of outward-facing public engagement at a variety of city events. And really, for me, it's so critically important to get this information and confidence into our residents, because the whole emergency management system and framework across Canada is essentially based upon everybody who is able doing their small part. And it's also based upon the other principle of you can't really access the next level up of support until you've exhausted or, used all of your own assets and resources that are available to you. So that sort of whole of society approach is really the sort of, excuse the term, but the sort of secret sauce behind making an emergency program work really well. People recognize the hazard, they jump to it, they get things going, they're tuned in, dialed into our communications that we're providing to them across multiple platforms. And across that whole spectrum, it actually works to reduce both the exposure to the event and also those vulnerabilities that we spoke of. Because of course, we can't control the hazards. We can only reduce our exposure and mitigate those vulnerabilities and adapt to live alongside it. And that's very much the focus of a lot of what our public engagement is, because really our visitors, businesses, residents are absolutely critical to our success. Where they're successful, we are more successful. And, profoundly, it enables us to support members of society that, maybe don't have the ability to provide or cover off some of this emergency response stuff on their own. And that provides, our colleagues in RCMP and Maple Ridge Fire Rescue, Ridge Meadow Search and Rescue, it enables them to focus their expertise and the assets they have on the folks that are most impacted, that need it the most. And that's important for two reasons. It's important because it is an unfortunate truth that emergency events disproportionately impact the most vulnerable and susceptible across society. So it's important that we can recognize that and focus our response capabilities to meet that need. And, the second point is that where there is, a major regional event, we're very lucky that our system does have a lot of mutual aid, both regionally, provincially, interprovincially, nationally, and even internationally. And we see that vividly during wildfire season where, the BC Wildfire Service frequently send crews, equipment, aircraft to support our neighbours to the south, Australia, Mexico, New Zealand. And you look at the horrific wildfire event in Los Angeles and the Palisades wildfire last January, even though the BC Wildfire Service are one of the first international agencies to put their hand up and say, yeah, we want to get down and assist you in getting the fight and reciprocate the help that you provide to us, it still takes 5 to 7 days to mobilise that workforce, train them, stage the equipment, forward ship the aircraft, the hardware, the people, integrate that into the local battle picture and so forth. That's also the same thing coming here, right? If we were to ever have a major event, it does take a bit of time for our regional, provincial partners and assets to come to bear and support us locally. So you hear a lot of these sort of buzz phrases like have a 72-hour kit or prepare for up to a week or beyond. And I feel it's very important for people to understand the mechanics behind why we tell them to do that. And that's a prime example of why, is because the longer you're self-sufficient or able to do things on your own without support, the longer of a runway that gives our provincial, federal and international partners to put those assets and people to bear to support us where these things take place.
We kind of have an expectation that if something goes wrong, it's going to get fixed right away. I know that we've been doing the emergency preparedness workshops, and the feedback I've received has been very positive. What can you tell us about the turnout? Who's showing up? How many folks are showing up at these events? And what are they getting out of it? Is there a surprise? Is there like, oh, I never knew this? Like, maybe just talk about the workshop itself.
Yeah, for sure. So we've had a phenomenal response to it. I think by sort of my crude estimate, we've probably seen about 2% of the population that have attended.
Wow.
And that said, we've done a lot. By the end of June, we'll have conducted about 42 public sessions, in addition to, a number of private sessions that we do for other sort of response or care providers or local partners. So we've had a really, really good turnaround. Unsurprisingly, it is really a broad spectrum. It is very much a reflection of Maple Ridge. A lot of diversity there, both in terms of, origin, people that have lived in Maple Ridge all their lives, all age brackets. The one thing that I have found interesting is that to address the point about, what is those sort of light bulb moments, a misconception to your point earlier that this won't happen to me. Interestingly, the federal government in, I believe it was 2023, conducted a study. It was Ipsos done this one, and what they found is of the surveyed population, only about 24% of us felt that we had made provisions, plans or supplies that actually would be in any way adequate. Despite that, over 50% of the population surveyed were moderately to extremely concerned about these events and impacts. That hadn't changed the behaviour. But interestingly, the provinces that were the most moved to do something about it and take actions were Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia. And why that is particularly surprising is because the survey took place 2 weeks after Hurricane Fiona had ravaged and caused significant widespread impacts and damage to both those provinces and to New Brunswick and Newfoundland and Labrador too. But it seems it's equal parts surprising and equal parts frustrating that it takes for one of these things to really hit us square on for that to be, the motivator for people to do things. So it's trying to help people sort of come to terms with like this is happening at frequency and impact. And when it does happen and you're unprepared, the recovery time is extensive. And really we want to shorten that down. So I think that's maybe the first eye opener for folks. The second is I think we've gone very myopic around buy a kit online, go and buy one of these one size fits all, one-stop shop. And they're good, they work. And if that's what works for your preference and that's how you are, perfect. But what I say to people is that the supplies and equipment that you require to be prepared for an emergency, you probably have about 80 to 90% of it at home already. Since I moved to British Columbia just over 10 years ago, the one thing I've come to realize about British Columbians is they typically like two very unique objects. One is large plastic totes from a variety of household goods stores.
I have one of those.
And the other is outdoor activities and the associated equipment and supplies and clothing that comes with. Marrying these two items together and putting it in a convenient, accessible place is, you find you've actually got a lot of things that you need already. And I, do a lot of research and a lot of reading in terms of, our Japanese counterparts because they have experienced some of the biggest major climatic events all around. And it's fascinating to me to learn how they navigate through those events. And one of the major tenets of their preparedness is just keep your cupboards stocked up. Just never let your cupboards go empty. Just change your grocery habits. Always have a little bit spare. Rotate your stock. anyone that's ever worked in retail or, ran a business of that kind will understand inventory management. And it's really just getting into that habit of doing that at home, because as sadly some of our neighbours have experienced recently, if, during these big heavy rain events, you have a washout, a landslide, a road is washed out. If you have a week to 2 weeks of groceries and food and resources at home, you can sit it out, and it's hugely inconvenient. We recognise that and we acknowledge that. But if you've got empty cupboards and about a day's worth of supplies, and that road isn't going to be safe to transit and be replaced for another week, then actually it becomes an emergency within 48 hours that requires resources and assets and support and trauma to help people get out. And certainly going back to the major atmospheric river event in 2021, those folks that find themselves cut off on the highway, not far away from here on Agassiz, the folks that had been away and had a lot of supplies, had maybe been away on, hunting trips or, family trips that had a lot of supplies and stocks, they found their experience stuck on the highway a good sight easier than the folks that were maybe just transiting back from a day trip or being to visit friends and family. So that's important. That's a big eye-opener for people. I think the second one really is when they start to understand, some of the limitations around what financial supports are available to folks when they're not insured.
You're absolutely right. I know for myself, I do have a go bag at home, though the water is probably expired by now. But I also make sure that I have in my car, I always carry a spare pair of boots in there, some warm clothing just in case I'm on the road when something happens. But it really comes down to how long do you have to be self-sufficient? And if we were to lose our water for a significant amount of time, a week to 2 weeks, well, that's not good. So at the very least, yes, have a pantry full of food, staples, but making sure that you have enough water. Those are what's going to help you get through. But my question is, what if you don't? What if you're just not prepared for anything? How does that impact the overall situation when you have a population of 110,000 and you're having a major event? What does that scenario look like?
Not good. Because, essentially to your point, and you've hit the nail on the head, is that it takes time to get sort of initial first response. But then if you include your infrastructure partners, some of your care providers, if you consider them sort of secondary response, it still takes a bit of time for those actors, be them, utility providers, be they, the folks that provide care. It still takes a sort of, 48 to 72 hour plus window for those assets, resources to get put into the mix to be able to restore things. So, and I think it really does depend where you are and what your lifestyle is, what emergency readiness looks like for somebody that lives in a 400 square foot apartment, what emergency preparedness looks like for them will probably look exceptionally different for somebody that lives very rurally. And that's why I encourage people to come along to the workshops, because this is the stuff we really get into the weeds on and help people to understand that those individual differences and how they live is really important to factor into how you get ready and how you organize things. And if everybody recognizes that, then it reduces the burden on our first responders. So the more people are organized and ready to go with all the things they need, shelter, water, food, items to help with their health and hygiene, medicines, spare contact lenses, washroom facilities, and also most importantly as well, things to keep them occupied and connected. Whether it's just a phone charger, a power bank, an alternate means of power or connectivity, and a couple of little board games or a couple of books, a Kindle, an iPad, whatever it is, something to pass the time. Because when the TV goes off and the power's out, all of a sudden it becomes quite a lonely place sitting there, waiting it out. And we've lost that, real key human skill of being okay in our own company in the quiet for quite a period of time. You're never alone with a phone and all that good stuff. So it's important to recognize that element of it as well when you're thinking about preparing for the long term. But it reduces the impacts on you. And seriously, it reduces the harm, both physically and psychologically on you and your family. And also it buys our responders and city staff time and enables them to triage effectively without having unnecessary is unfair, but perhaps avoidable call-outs and emergencies to deal with.
So your role is in part educational, it's in part preparation. You act as a liaison to all of our departments. I think one of the dangers that any city has is the silo effect where, this is my property here, this is my territory, go away, leave me alone. and we've tried to break those silos down in the city. And yours is a key role that helps do that and make sure that every department is prepared and ready for understanding what that process is. So if something bad happens, there's a system that kicks into place. Beyond that, do you show up at emergencies? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. I spend so much impetus on public outreach and engagement to reduce the amount of times I have to show up at things, which is very self-serving of me, but it comes from a place of care and kindness. But yes, the big bulk of my job is reactive and operationally driven event. It's my role to facilitate our emergency operations centre and our emergency operations team, which is a large group of folks from across all city departments, from all levels, from senior leadership all the way down to, folks that are technical experts on particular technical facing elements, be that water, sewerage, drainage, public works, roads, transportation, communications, often risk, safety, legal, big group of internal people, but also broadly our external partners as well, not just our neighbouring municipalities and Indigenous government colleagues, but also our critical infrastructure providers, the emergency management and climate readiness ministry from the province. So it really, that old saying, it takes a village. It's very true of successful emergency response as well. So there's a lot of liaison that goes in there as well. I spend way too much time looking at news, weather, geopolitical events, and sort of trying to get ahead of these things. A common misconception, I think, about sort of folks in the emergency management or sort of, resilience profession is that we really love doing emergency operations centres and being up for 18 hours a day for, unforeseen weeks at a time. For me, that's not the case. I like to do everything in my power to avoid having to do an emergency operations centre, because that means the public's safe and managing at the sort of issues level, not the major event level. It is a significant part to it. And perhaps one of the things that I think we should all be most proud of as a city is I'm responsible on behalf of the Ministry of Emergency Management of facilitating our emergency volunteer programs. And we have two here in the city. We have the Emergency Support Services team and we have the Emergency Radio Communicators team. These are probably your neighbours, folks you see around town that give up their free time to be trained, to essentially be on call, to respond to any event or emergency which displaces people from their primary residence. And that's anything from, an individual structure trailer or apartment fire, all the way up to, potentially a major event that requires us to evacuate large numbers of people to remove them from, perhaps a wildfire or a flood or an area that's unsafe due to structural damage or anything else that may happen, or potentially even like a long-term utility outage. And these folks show up all weathers, all days of the week, often in the middle of the night. And, after, our fire, police and ambulance colleagues have helped people, often the next person that those folks that have just maybe lost their home see is one of these ESS responders or one of our emergency communicators. So the work they do is exceptional, and, it would be remiss of me not to just really, pump their tires on this opportunity to speak about it, because they're great people. I think they represent the best of Maple Ridge. They do it for nothing other than it's the right thing to do, and they want to help their neighbours and their community. And again, the door is always open, and we are always hiring, for lack of a better term. So if anybody listening to this is I quite like the sound of that, I could get involved in that. Please do check us out on the city website under the emergency readiness page, because the more folks we have engaged in this type of work, the stronger we are, and the more people we can help faster, and the quicker we can get people back to, their normal lives and moving forwards again.
Yeah, I remember about 2 months after I was elected, we had the Edge Street fire, which is one of the worst fires we've had in this city going back quite a while. And I live a couple of blocks away from there. And when I looked out my window, the entire sky was bright red in the evening. And clearly you saw something was going on. So I got dressed, ran out. It was about 10 o'clock at night. And sure enough, we watched the whole thing unfold and watched our fire department there. We had teams coming in from Mission Fire Department, from Poco Fire Department, from Pitt Fire Department. We had RCMP from all over the Lower Mainland showing up to help. TransLink had brought out a bus because it was raining to house some of the people that were displaced. The building that burnt down wasn't occupied, but it had jumped over to the building behind it. And so you did have quite a few people that were displaced. And I watched how even then I know we got the Greg Moore Youth Center opened up for displaced folks. The Legion, which is a couple of blocks away, at midnight opened their doors, serve coffee and food. These don't happen by accident, but I was impressed to see the amount of public offering to help. And that's impressive. And from there, we took a look at what was going on with our firefighter services. And, we made some hard decisions to increase our firefighter services, to increase our first responders, because we weren't a town anymore of 40,000. We're 110 that we're going to break this year. And we need to be prepared for any emergencies that come along. And then your position came up and you were hired. And what I do like about that role that you play, a lot of it is prevention. Those workshops have been very well received, but also working with some of the groups, the Alouette Valley residents that experience flooding at time to time. I think the last couple of years have actually been a little bit better, but you're also working with, the challenges of some of the businesses out there like Humble Roots, because they tend to get flooded every time that we have a major flooding event. And it's not as if we can just stop the water from flowing, but there's a lot of work that has to be done. And that's the role that you play, I think, is critical to how fast we recover. We can't stop these events from happening, but it's how fast we can recover. And maybe talk about that part of your job.
Yeah, for sure. I think the first thing to sort of touch on there is that we are in a different time in terms of how these events take place, their severity, how quickly they can come about. And it is different. And I think, the hard thing for me in my job is to help people just to accept the reality that things have changed. The way things used to be from sort of, river volumes, rainfall, extreme heat, temperature, drought, wildfire risk, they've changed for the worst. And unfortunately, they're going to continue to trend that way. We need to support people and assist them to live alongside these threats and hazards and harden their home, change their patterns, their routines, and make it so that folks can live alongside this stuff. And where there are impacts and damages, that we can help them get connected to agencies, service providers, and other groups that can support them and get them through and get them back on their feet and recovered. Recovery is the weakest area for the province at this point. And unfortunately, you don't need to go much further than, locally here in Lytton and Jasper and some of these other communities that sadly have become synonymous with these major events. Recovery can take years. And, one of the really important factors to understand about recovery is it starts right now. It's not something that happens after the event's already taken place. The losses have been incurred, the damages are there, the people have been displaced. At that point, it's really difficult. A successful recovery is built today, and it's rebuilt through working together. It's built through partnerships. It's built through local businesses being engaged in part of our response. Where, goodness forbid we were ever to have a major event here, of course, there'll be provincial and federal supports that will come here, but it's really, really vital that where that support financially, both from government and also from, NGOs, folks like the Red Cross, like Team Rubicon, United Way, where those resources come into the community, it's really important that those dollars are spent locally with local businesses because they employ local people. Where local people still have jobs and are able to contribute to, the rebuilding, the restoration, the recovery of our community, then the better off the prognosis and outcome is. And, reducing those socio and economic losses is one of the reasons why I'm doing all the preparedness stuff today. A real sad thing for me is that where these events happen, and I think particularly of, remote rural Indigenous communities in northern Saskatchewan and northern Manitoba, and even here too in British Columbia, often where a big major event does take place, those folks are evacuated initially for safety out of community, out of their home. Too often than not, those folks never are able to get back and successfully reestablish themselves there. And for me, there's an enormous tragedy in that cuts across all of us. So it is really, really important to recognise is that those relationships, that mutual understanding, that interoperability, that sort of acceptance of where we are and how this is going to be, the more steps that we can make today as a team, the better off our outcomes are going to be in recovery and the faster we can get people back on their feet. And for me, actually, looking at some of the broader priorities that we have here in the city, where a local government can demonstrate they do that with high efficacy and high success, to me, that's a quality standard in terms of where you're choosing to put your investment, where you're choosing to place your growth in the hands of a government partner. So for me, it is a bit of a quality mark of the city as well, that we can do this well, not just for the people that live here and recreate here, but also for the folks, that are looking at a prospective new site for their new manufacturing facility or their new office or something like that. That's just one small factor of many factors that go into their decision when choosing their next home or their next facility. So for me, it's actually very sort of invert that, rather than focusing on recovery after the fact, focus on making ourselves very, very strong and resilient right now so that we can absorb these impacts and it doesn't derail us.
Yeah, and again, a large part for me was just watching that fire unfold and seeing the good things that were happening and then seeing the gaps that were happening. You mentioned Lytton and Jasper as a couple of examples. Could that happen here?
It could happen anywhere.
Are we prepared for that?
Why leave it to chance? Do the small things now that are well within our control, because once you're staring down the barrel of one of these events, it's too late. And there's a number of small, free, easy steps that everybody listening to this, regardless of whether you live in Maple Ridge or wherever you live in Canada or beyond, there's a couple of things that you can do right this moment after listening to this podcast. They're going to give you an edge. One is to know your hazards. Look up whatever your local alerting software is. For us in the city of Maple Ridge, we've just moved towards a system called Alertable. That will tell you all about the hazards and events as they take place. So know your risks. You all have a phone. You all have smartphones. You spend most of your time walking around the streets looking at one. Make it work for you in an emergency context. Let it tell you when something's going wrong and tell you what to do about it. Step one, take you 30 seconds to do that. The next one is, if you do live in Maple Ridge or the local vicinity, come along to one of our emergency workshops. If I haven't put you to sleep by now, you can endure another 2 hours of me talking at you. There's also a whole raft of resources and tools and materials that we will put in your hands, both digitally and physically, that you can take away with you. Get involved in drills and programs. Look up FireSmart. Delve into your insurance policy and see what it actually covers. Participate in fire drills and shakeout on an annual basis at home or at work. Look at things that you can do to lower the risk. Look up the Breathe project from SFU. Make one of those air scrubbers for your home. Look into, the pros and cons of maybe installing a heat pump in your home. All these are things that you can do around your home and around your workplace today that are going to help you. Another thing that, I really, really want to mention is to go back to the emergency support services team. That service you can subscribe for and sign up in advance. And you do that using the BC Services Card app. So that's the exact same app that you use to access your medical records, your vaccination details, and other provincial services that you consume. So if you've got that app, or if you don't, download it, look up ESS and pre-register you and your household for that event. Does two major things. One, it enables our volunteers to serve you faster and more efficiently, which again prevents people that are vulnerable from having to wait in a lineup for hours and hours at a time. So it speeds things up and helps us to get you on your way. And more importantly, if you're registered through that service card app, it means that we can actually provide you with those funds where you're eligible with an Interact e-transfer, which means you can have that money in your bank account within 4 to 6 hours from registering for that event when an event takes place. So that's a really, really important thing that you can do today as a resident of British Columbia. And there's similar things in other provinces and territories too. So I think hopefully if this has been eye-opening for you in any way and any of the things that we've discussed today. And again, the other, maybe perhaps the thing that I'll finish on is that don't do this on your own. We're social creatures. If you live in a strata, get together as a strata. Maybe get together as a faith group, sports team, group of folks that go to the pub on a Friday, whatever it looks like for you. Have these conversations. And then when it starts to get weird and a bit awkward, send them to me. Tell them to sign up for one of the workshops and I'll have the awkward, weird conversation with them for you on your behalf for a period of 2 hours in the library or the Albion Community Centres. But all that to say is it is really important, because in a major event, to get back to the root of your question, could this happen here? Well, it could. And if it does, you are the help until help arrives. So when you're doing that as a formed up group of people, you will find this is easier, because if you do this in a group like a strata, just to use an example, I can almost guarantee you that some of the folks in that group will maybe be in the medical profession, might be nurses, might be doctors, might be veterinarians, might be folks that have prerequisite skills that can help you. There may be tradespeople. What are some of the major things that happen after an emergency event? People need fixed and things need fixed. So where you've got that community group together that can do that, and it's no different to some of our existing programs like, the RCMP Neighbourhood Watch and some of the other community groups that we rely and enjoy participating in. Add that to the list of things that you can do together and support each other with, because it really does make all the difference. And it is proven that where communities prepare and respond together, They have better outcomes faster. So it really is actually, there is science behind it as well, not just sort of goodwill and politeness. It works and it's proven to work.
Yeah, time is winding down. I could spend another couple of hours talking about this, but I'll leave it like this. Think of the last time that your internet went down and you had no TV and you had no phone. What did you do? Were you able to call anybody? Were you able to Google anything? And that's where you feel, oh my gosh, that moment of panic. What's going on? I don't know what's happening in the outside world. Do you have a battery operated radio that will help you get some of that news that is going on out there? But, I will say that the city, we don't just respond to emergencies. We have to find a way to build our city to withstand any type of emergencies that come in. And I think that's important.
I'll maybe close it out with a real world example that illustrates that exact point. If we take you back to New Year's Day 2024, fairly large, significant earthquake off the west coast of Japan. Any loss of life is too many, but it was, a very, very small number of folks that were impacted and harmed. And it was a 7.8 magnitude earthquake. If you go back to similar earthquakes, in Turkey and Syria the year before, the casualty rate in terms of lives lost was 50,000. You go back further still, the similar event in Haiti in 2010, it was over 100,000 people. And the difference between those numbers, between Japan, Turkey, Syria, and Haiti, is simple. It's readiness and preparedness. That's the difference.
I don't know a better way to end this podcast by what you just said, other than to say it's up to our listeners out there. Take the first step. Download the app, attend a session, make a plan. But, the city is here to provide as much information as possible, because in those emergency situations, that's how we're going to come out of it on the better end, is working as a group, as a city, as a one city approach. And, I'm proud of the work that has been done to date, but I'm also looking forward to what this continued picture looks like. How do we continue to expand what you're doing and making sure people are actually hearing that? There's a small group of people that you said have shown up to your workshops. We need more people to show up. We need more people to get involved. And volunteers, I've said it time and time again, we have the best volunteers in the country. Something happens, whether it's for good or bad, people will show up. And you know your neighbors more than anybody else. So we don't need to overwhelm the hospital emergency rooms if you know your neighbors and you're talking to them and you're preparing that. And that, I think, is the key. We can't prevent the emergencies, but we can control the end result of that and how we move from there. Ed, thank you for taking the time out of your busy day. I know you're extremely busy. Thank you for taking the time and sharing your thoughts and your experiences and your expertise with us. You're an amazing addition to the city team, and thanks for all that you do.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for having me on. And again, as a final thought, we want you to be prepared, not scared.
Well, I like that.